So there I was, waiting for my dad to walk through the door. I remember feeling a good deal of apprehension, but also excitement. It was much like a scene at an airport, where loved ones reunite with someone from a plane. Love is in the air, there's long hugs, there's kisses, but this wasn't really an airport. The best way I could describe it was more a cafeteria. Cold, bland wallpaper, even those vending machines we remember from high school over on the corner. Only there were no students here. I do remember my dad saying he wanted strawberries. That's all he wanted, strawberries. He lived for strawberries. So I got the strawberries. I walked back to the table that I had reserved by the window. I felt like some sunshine would do us good. And so I waited patiently. And after about 10 minutes, my dad walks through the door in a green jumpsuit. You see, this was FPC Pensacola, a federal prison camp. You know, growing up, my dad was my hero. My parents raised us in Cooper City, your typical cookie-cutter suburb where my dad was a pediatrician. He had his own private practice. He also worked in the ER. And the best way to describe my dad, take a 6'2" guy from Miami, throw in the genius of Dr. House, the bedside manner a mix between Andy Kaufman and Patch Adams, all going a mile a minute like Robin Williams doing stand-up back in the 80s. You know, when he was on the good stuff. If you were to stop by my dad's practice back in the day, you'd find a doctor on roller skates, gliding between patient rooms. If you were to visit the ER on a holiday, specifically Halloween, you'd find a man that went over the top. My personal favorite was when he dressed up as Dr. Evil, complete with a life-size mini-me doll strapped to his chest. That was my dad. And then in my teens, my parents divorced, and things got rocky. I found out things about my hero that made me question whether I really knew the man I looked up to for so long. Financial mismanagement, lies on top of lies, broken promises, infidelity, the list went on. And things were really rocky for a while, for a number of years, to be honest with you. But as I got older, we reconnected. We sought to rebuild the relationship that had broken and frayed. I went off to college. We stayed close. You know, growing up, money was always tight, and that didn't change till about my sophomore year. I remember my dad sharing that he had a new cushy job that paid really well. For my brother, sister, and I, all we knew was we were getting a weekly allowance. I got a 60-inch TV delivered to my apartment, and my sister got to go to Vegas for her 21st birthday. Now, don't get me wrong, she kind of roughed it. She stayed at the Wynn and a penthouse in the Bellagio. Quite the life. I finally felt proud of my dad because it seemed like he figured out how to mix that genius and also helping people and make some serious cash as well. But the fantasy wasn't to last. That went on for about a year, and I remember the night that my grandma called me, and she shared that she had came upon an article that mentioned my dad in relation to a pain clinic. I was with my sister at the time. We were naive in college. We didn't really understand what a pain clinic was, but the fear in my grandma's voice couldn't be ignored. We started calling my dad frantically, calling and calling and calling, and finally he responded. He started to go on the offensive, freaking out that my grandma, got us all worked up. He claimed he wasn't involved. It was all a big misunderstanding. And so, over the next year, the web of lies that had built up until that point had started to unravel. I remember being in the back of my fraternity house when I got a call from my dad. It was my sister, my brother, and I on the phone, and that's when he finally revealed the truth. He was a doctor, what's called a pill mill clinic. And what that means is he was writing illegal scripts, illegal prescriptions for opioids like Oxycontin to those willing to pay top dollar. The weekly allowance, the 60-inch TV, the trips to Vegas, all funded from this illegal activity. Over the next year, I remember hearing the full details of his involvement, and it became quite clear that my dad would be made an example of here in South Florida. we found out soon how much of an example that would be. On January 7, 2014, Dr. Scott Becker was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Pretty soon after that, maybe a day or two later, an article came out detailing the sentence, detailing his crime. All of Cooper City knew about the former doctor on skates, now rolling right into a jail cell. But for me, the biggest fear I had was I hoped he didn't go into one of those don't drop the soap kind of prisons. You know what I mean? Join the gang or die, some shit like that. So, but because my dad's crime wasn't considered a violent one, he was actually sentenced to the federal prison camp that I described when the story began, FPC Pensacola. Now before you go on and think it's a tennis court and pool style prison camp, white collar crime type of place, not so. Imagine a bankrupt summer camp complete with barbed wire, shit food, security detail, and the fact that these campers can never leave. FPC Pensacola, no place like home, the new home for my dad for the next couple of years. Because he was sentenced in Pensacola, I had the opportunity to go to visit him on various occasions over the next couple of years. And what I saw was incredibly inspiring. It was a man who started to embark on a journey of his own. A journey where he began to reflect and finally have the time, the attention to see where his life, how his life brought him to this point, what behaviors and actions contributed to him being behind bars. He described it as, since his teenage years, he was always insecure. He described himself as insecure, people-pleasing, automatic, moving a mile a minute to really cover up for these inadequacies he felt for so long. In terms of joining the pill mill clinic, he described it as, his back was against the wall. A judge had told him that if he didn't start paying alimony to my family, he'd be thrown in jail. Kind of ironic, right? Yeah. So in jail he went. And what was great and what I really remember is during those times I finally felt like I got to know the real Scott Becker. A man who was real. A man who was finally taking responsibility for his actions. And so then in March, I watched the movie Flight. And in Flight, Denzel Washington plays pilot Will Whitaker, who during a crash landing miraculously saves a plane full of people. Over the course of the movie, we find out that Will Whitaker is an alcoholic. And in the climax of the film, he's on trial testifying about the day's events. He gets bombarded with question after question after question, and eventually he breaks. He admits that he was drunk for the flight, that he, for the first time publicly, reveals he's an alcoholic. He goes to jail. The scene shifts to him in an AA meeting in prison, and he shares the following with his inmates. Something to the degree of, I came to my lifelong limit of telling lies. I could not tell one more lie. And if I could tell just one more lie, I could have gotten away from the whole mess. I could have walked away, kept my wings, my false sense of pride. But instead I'm locked up in here with all you nice people. And I've done a lot of reflecting. And it's going to sound pretty stupid coming from a guy in prison, but for the first time in my life, I finally feel free. As soon as I watched the scene, I got incredibly emotional. Anger came up. The anger of my dad lying to me, of finally finding out the truth. The sense of sadness, not being able to do anything about it. Helplessness, watching him go through this on his own. A lot of emotion. But over these visits, what I started to see was a different story, a different journey. What I really appreciated was, again, a man who was taking responsibility for his actions. Just like in the movie, what I saw in my dad since his incarceration was that relaxed, weight off his shoulders, sense of freedom, much like Denzel's character described. Finally feeling free. And so, looking back, when I was a kid, my dad was my hero because of the stories I heard from the ER, from his patients at his practice. Today, my dad remains my hero because he showed me how a man owns up to his actions, takes responsibility for them, soldiers on and moves forward in spite of what's against him. Today, we're stronger than ever. We just spoke on Christmas morning. I'm happy to share he's due to be released in March 21st of this next year. Thank you. And so take it from me. Next time you're talking to someone and they share they have a loved one in prison, I've had enough awkward interactions where they treat them as though a person has died. I'm sorry, and all I can muster up is a thanks. And so with that, I say thank you. Thanks for listening. Our next speaker is a gentleman